Hi, everybody. Welcome to episode 2 of Unlearning the Activist Script, a series, an exploratory series designed by Anthea Lawson, built on her work in finding the patterns, parallels, and scripts of activists around the world. And I say activists in the widest sense of anybody who can enact some sort of change, personal or political, in their environments, in their contexts, identifying pathologies, which are just opportunities and challenges to rise up to. Acknowledging those pathologies that we all face is actually our convergence point. It's a way in which we are one. And today's session focuses on urgency, this notion of things are fast-paced, we need to have answers, we need to mobilize, we need to move, and how to explore that further. I don't want to actually give away too much because we're going to dive into it. But we have a special guest, like we do in each different session, different voices, different biographies, and different ideas being brought to the table for this series, because it is a collective journey and investigation. And we're super fortunate to have Nick Anim, who's the co-director of the Transition Town of Brixton in London, researcher on environment and sustainable development, and collective action seems to be the bread and butter. How to build healthy social movements and build solidarity across giant distances that seem to be the perceived distances. And all of this also is an expression of Anthea's research on the Entangled Activist. And we also have done an online session with Anthea before. Conversations evolved, and here we are at this point, examining our blind spots and seeing how we can rise to the occasion in these mad times, which is something that I feel like we're saying every year anyway. Handing it over to Anthea, and take it away.
Thanks, Ivan. Hello, everyone. I'm Anthea Lawson. My pronouns are she and her. Welcome to this second session on Unlearning the Activist Script, this one on urgency. Thanks for those. I see some names of people here last week. I also see some names of people who weren't. Welcome, everyone. Before we even get into thinking about what we could do better in our activism, I just want to honour all the work that we are all doing already. All of that work and energy and intention showing up day after day, year after year, trying to make things better. So Ivan's already given a bit of an outline of what we're going to do. I'll just give you a little more detail so you know what's coming. We're going to be in, Nick's going to speak. I'm going to just give a little bit of introduction to this idea of an activist script. And then Nick's going to introduce us to urgency. And we're going to talk for about 15-20 minutes. And then we're going to pause just after past for an exercise that you'll do. And then we'll do just for a little bit. And then we'll be in more conversation until about the hour. And then we'll do another short exercise, another opportunity to reflect on what you've been receiving and what's coming up for you. And then there'll be some open space for feedback and then conversation, should there be comments. Nick and I have realised over the last year of being in very regular conversations about social movements and activism that we can talk for England. So we're not going to run out of stuff, but we really want you to be joining in as well. So a little bit of background on me. I'll try and say it in a slightly different way for those who were here last week. I started out in news journalism. I was a reporter at the Times in London. And then I moved to reporting and investigating for campaign groups for NGOs on the arms trade, on tax havens, on illegal logging, the terrible things that mining and oil companies get up to. And after about 15 years, I sort of stepped sideways and I ended up writing The Entangled Activist, a book about how we are part of the problem that we're trying to fix. Because I was trying to make, me trying to make sense of this kind of repeated noticing that we were doing many of the things that we were trying to stop. We might have human rights advocates treating each other badly. We might be burning out ourselves, trying to stop an endless industrial growth system burning out the planet. And I was curious about what was going on. And my conclusion, the very simple one, that we're entangled in what we're trying to change, sort of sounded a bit obvious in some ways, but in some ways it's extremely countercultural, both to the mainstream culture, which tells us we're separate from everyone and everything else, and we're above nature and we can control what we like and invent stuff that will just solve everything. And it's a bit countercultural to activist life as well, where we like to think that we're the good ones, and so we don't want to be we don't want to sully ourselves with being part of the mess that we're trying to change. And so we can't change our entanglement. It's best to acknowledge it. It's best to start from that point. And of course, our different positions might affect how we're entangled. But then I started to get curious about whether we can respond differently to some of the patterns we're in. And I started to see that some of those patterns looked a bit like a script that says things like, we're good, we must change people, we must make things perfect, we must save the world, we must sacrifice ourselves. It's urgent. And when I say scripts, I don't mean it tells us the actual words that we say. It's not as a literal script like that. It's more a sort of the underlying assumptions that underpin our actions and our words. It's like a set of tracks that we can get on. We're not really conscious of them. They might be tracks that are running in society. There might be tracks that are running in our psyches, our shared human psyches. They might be quite deep and mythic. And one of the things I picked up from last session, the one last week on knowing the answer, is that perhaps we can be a bit clearer that in order to look at how the script operates, we may move at times away from speaking really, really literally about activism. We might need to get into some of these underlying principles about how we function as humans or how society works, because that's where some of the scripts that drive us come from. So I suppose what I'm saying is, if you find yourself thinking, hold on, I'm scratching my head here, I can't quite see how this fits with my work, just float along for a bit, hang in there. It may come back round to something that lands for you, and we hope that the exercises will help with that. So look, before we get into urgency, just a couple of things to remember. As always, when I'm using the word activism, I have no hierarchy of activism. You don't need to be out in the streets or getting arrested or doing X, Y, Z for it to count as activism. And there's a lot of that out there. I think I'm using it to mean all change making work. Anything that we're doing to try to make the world a better place. You know, we can have endless semantic discussions about it, but the word sort of trips off my tongue when I'm talking about this. And so please feel that whatever you are doing, I'm guessing it is change makers in some sense who are curious to come to this. We are speaking about what you're doing. Another thing to say is that depending on our positionality, on who we are, the urgency that we're going to talk about might make itself known differently to us. If you're in frontline work to protect or heal people from harm, if you're in high intensity fight for your own survival, the urgency that you experience is a very tangible threat and a pressure on you. If you're in low intensity struggle, I'm using this very helpful distinction from Hospicing Modernity by Vanessa Machado de Oliveira. Really, really helpful book. I should have mentioned it last week as well. Then our urgency can be more about our perception of what's happening to other people who we want to help, or about what's heading towards all of us. Now, we may be in different positions on some of this here this evening. So I'd like to ask that we meet each other in good faith in this exploration, which means good listening, giving each other the benefit of the doubt. And if we're having a strong reaction to something that's being said, perhaps taking the time that we need to settle before we respond. Let's take time away from the screen if we need it. That urge to react quickly, to come into a comment quickly, to come into a response quickly, that urgency is all part of what we're looking at here. And we're all at differing levels of practice of that. So look, thank you for sharing, some of you in the comments, what kind of urgency in your work that you're bringing. I'm going to hand over to Nick now, just to talk for a few minutes about what urgency means to him, and then we'll do some talking. All right.
Thank you so much. Thanks, my dear Anthea, and thank you, Ivan, for hosting this and supporting this, and tech support and so on. So I want to begin by saying hello to everyone, and extending that hello, I say salam and shalom, and I say salam and shalom in the hope of peace, recognizing the catastrophe catastrophe of urgency unfolding in the Middle East as we speak. What we're witnessing is physical death, spiritual death, psychic death, social death, civic death. All of those continually sort of bombarding, raining down on people as we convene here this evening. And it strikes me that within that urgency, what we are witnessing is a partial eclipse of humanity and a total eclipse of what's the Hebrew scriptures say is called Hesed. And Hesed is, as I said, Hebrew word that means kindness or love between people. It is found 250 times in the Old Testament and describes a sense of love and loyalty that inspires merciful and compassionate behavior towards another person, towards other people. And on that note of compassion towards the other, I also want to say Sawubona, which is a Zulu greeting that carries the importance of recognizing the worth and dignity of each person, which Anthea referred to in terms of respecting the space and respecting each other, whatever we bring to the space. And Sawubona as a greeting means I see you. It says, I see the whole of you, your experiences, your passions, your pain, your fears, your strengths, your weaknesses, and your future. You are valuable to me. So to each and every one of you, I thank you for joining us, and I see you. The response to Sawubona, just as a side note, is Yebo Sawubona, meaning I see you too. And of course, seeing is a dialogue, and we're seeing each other right now. We're having this dialogue. In the past times, following the greetings Sawubona and Yebo Sawubona, people would respond with the greeting Njani, which means how are you? But it strikes me as quite ironic that, as the geographer David Harvey once said, we have so many things to save us time, but we have so little time. So these days, as opposed to people following up with Njani, the greeting of how are you, Sawubona has become quite a quick greeting within Zulu traditions, not in the villages of South Africa, but mainly in the cities. So in the description, in the words for this event, Anthea alluded to something that Martin Luther King said. Again, he was talking about war in 1967, and that was about the Vietnam War. And he said, we are now faced with the fact that tomorrow is today. We are confronted with the fierce urgency of now. In this unfolding conundrum of life and history, there is such a thing as being too late. This is no time for apathy or complacency. This is a time for vigorous and positive action. And that very much speaks to the topic of urgency that's we're convened here sort of to hold this conversation about. So just very briefly, I come to this conversation as Ivan spoke about. I come from a scholar activist point of view. My background is in development planning, and my area of interest is in collective action and contemporary social and environmental movements. How the main question that I address in pretty much everything I do in terms of research and activism is to try to find out how we can build solidarity across differences. And in that respect, I focus on race matters. That means I may say some things in this conversation that might unsettle you. It might unhouse some of you. And I'm afraid to say I make no apologies because we're here to learn together in that respect. My particular perspective has been deeply shaped by critiques of empire, predatory capitalism, white supremacy, and the ways in which all of these are interwoven, producing these multiple conjunctures that we face and which call us onto the streets or whichever form of activism that we pursue. I look at the world through a moral and spiritual lens of justice. So I'm very tied to the prophetic voices of the Black radical tradition, and which is defined as the continuing development of a collective consciousness informed by the historical struggles for liberation and motivated by the shared sense of obligation to preserve the collective being. The Black radical tradition offers sort of moral revolutions in terms of a collective freedom and also dignity. It's not just for Black people, it's for the whole world as it were. This relates, of course, to spreading the Hesed, as I spoke about earlier on. So within all of that, we find this elephant in the room in whatever we do, which is this matter of urgency. And urgency has many effects on us, on our psychic being, on our physical being, on how we see the world, and what we do in order to counteract that urgency. And we have a lot of, we've discussed this at great length, met with Anthea, I think Monday it was, and we discussed this. So we're going to talk about a lot of things, a lot of questions. How does urgency deal with our soul craft as beings, or our soul craft in terms of the movements that we work with? And by soul craft, I mean, how does it get us to attend, pay attention to the things that matter, to attend to the things that matter, not just the things on the surface, not just the things that are driving us to either get on the streets or to get into collective action with other people? How does urgency interact with how we see the root causes of that urgency? Anthea, my dear.
Thank you. That's the perfect introduction. I feel like you've just sort of touched on, and we can now sort of start to draw on some of these threads, some of the main directions here, because I found myself drawing, I quite like drawing diagrams when I'm thinking about ideas. I get sort of, my head is always so full of words that it's sometimes easier to make it a bit more graphic. And it felt like I drew two arrows going in sort of opposite directions over each other earlier on, as I was thinking about the two trajectories that we're talking about. And at first they seem paradoxical, but actually I think the point is that they're linked. So one of them is, as you say, we want in some ways more urgency. We want to recognize, we want to encompass more of the urgency of what's out there. And if we can't see it all, then, as you say, what you used a lovely phrase, the partial, and a tragic phrase, like the partial eclipse of our humanity. Like, if we can't feel it all, if we can't act in a way that honors the bigger picture, so that feels like a call somehow to more urgency, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
At the same time, we all know, everyone here will know, that when we go at it too fast, in ourselves, when we go at it too urgently in our way of being, we crash and burn.
Mm-hmm.
So this is the spectre of burnout. And at first it feels like, well, hold on, what are we saying here? It's like, well, we need more of it and we need less of it. But actually, I think there's it struck me, I don't know how you see this. So I'm at the end of a cough here. That there's a link between them, because when we are going too fast in ourselves, in our way of being, that way of being that can lead to burnout, when we make the circle go too fast and sort of spin ourselves around too quickly, that's when we can't hear. Mm-hmm. That's when we can't listen. That's when we can end up kind of cutting things off. That's when we can end up making those decisions that sound like saying, oh, well, we can't look at that because this bit's really urgent.
Absolutely.
Is that how you bring those two trajectories together?
Absolutely. And it's what I refer to, I said sort of we don't actually, with urgency, what often happens is that we develop, Ivan alluded to it earlier on, we develop these blind spots because we take this blanket view. It is so urgent, we need to act on it now, and then we end up not looking perhaps even at the root causes of the issues that we face. And urgency drives us. Of course, we need that urgency. We need the energy of that urgency. We need the anger often of that urgency, in order to drive. But then we urgency, as I often describe it, is actually very good for tactics, but not so good for strategy, because with the strategy, we need to look at the visions that we want to achieve, the future visions and so on. And this, what did fella say? And that's in Zombie that we were just listening to before. Zombie no go chop unless you tell them to chop. Zombie no go sleep unless you tell them to sleep. And that means we end up, burning ourselves out, because sometimes I find myself doing exactly that, and I have to check myself. I won't eat, I won't sleep, because everything feels so urgent, and I'm dashing from the courtroom to the streets to all these different obligations. And burnout is such a real issue for us, and we need to just stop sometimes and just check ourselves, take a look in the mirror and see what is going on with ourselves, because without ourselves, we can't bring the love that we need to the solutions.
Yeah. Do you know, so can I tell you, I haven't told you about this. When I was in my mid-20s, I burnt out completely. This is before I was even an activist, and this is what gives me a bit of it's a thread to follow for me, because it shows me that that urge for urgency has a component. Of course, there is the political component that we want to do stuff, and of course, there's the component that we may be personally affected, but there is also a component, a tributary, maybe that's better, a stream that comes from within. So I was 25, I was a journalist, I had a job on a big newspaper, and I became too ill to work, like for a year. I really, and what it took me a long and difficult time to work out was that it was because of how I used to go at things. There was something in myself, a feeling of not enoughness, that was prompting me to do that. A feeling of scarcity, of fear, I suppose. It used to be, I mean, this is 25 years ago, I used to be quite anxious about achievement, about making my way, about, all sorts of things. Despite, coming from a middle class background, I think it was the middle class version of it. It involved expectations and, feeling one needs to meet certain things. And I totally get that's only one story. There are many other versions.
Yeah.
Burning out can be because capitalism has put impossible pressure on somebody. And that's also burnout.
And just going off your the need, for achievement and so on, linked to that is a fear of failure, which I think urgency, also drives urgency in many respects. There's this fear that it's urgent, we're facing all these crises, and if we don't get out onto the streets, okay, so right now we have for example, the climate and ecological crisis, which is driving a lot of movements, very prominent movements within this country and pretty much all around the world. And then we also have the crisis of inequality within and between countries, which we're witnessing right now between Israel and Gaza. Well, the governments, there. And what it can do, I often find, if we don't check ourselves, is make us turn into this military particularisms, where we don't look at the bigger picture. We really don't look at the bigger picture, and that bigger picture includes ourselves, how we are situated within this calling, and I've burnt out too. I've burnt out several times, in fact, and I rarely learn, unfortunately, from these burnouts.
That's funny. I was about to ask you what you learned, what you do to catch yourself.
Yeah,
because I feel like I can catch myself a bit now, and it so far, fingers crossed, I'll touch some wood. Here's a bookshelf. So far, I can sort of see ways to kind of see it coming. I still it starts coming, and then I'm like, oh no, hold on, I know this pattern.
Yeah,
you need to not do this.
And for me, I kind of try to find a third way of dealing with it, which is writing. I spend a lot of time writing and reflecting on what I've learned or what has been happening, and trying to better understand what's going on. And in understanding that, I find some sort of calm, some sort of responses that work, in addressing the potential burnout that's I often see coming. That's it.
That's good. I actually remembered a story from when I first started a job in about 2006. I know we need to move to the exercise in a minute, but when I realized this, I was just like, oh my God, this is such a good indication of the urgency in me, where I was starting up a campaign looking at banks and how they were facilitating human rights abuses and kleptocracy, massive corruption, basically, in various countries that were very rich in natural resources. And a colleague who worked on Democratic Republic of Congo, and there was a review of mining contracts, and she called me over because she knew I dealt with anything to do with banks. she was like, there's this conflict of interest, there's a bank involved, can you look into it? And almost before she'd stopped talking, I started flapping about sort of next to her desk and talking very, very fast. You know, I'm 6 foot tall as well, so there's a lot of me sort of like making this big sort of song and dance next to her desk. And I was like, we can do this, and we can do this, we can get it in the newspaper, and I was going on and on. And she just sort of sat there, and finally she just sort of looked up at me and just said, are you all right? I was like, oh God, right, here's a mirror for how we're doing this. So it would now be I think now's a good point to pause on this point of having chatted about burnout for a minute and do this first reflection exercise.
Absolutely.
So if everyone has got a pen and paper, feel free to turn your camera off if you've got it on, and because I'm going to encourage you to just sort of move around a bit and have a little sort of reflection on it, but do come back afterwards. We're just going to explore what it feels like for there to be enough. So sit comfortably, feel the floor or the sofa or the seat that you're on, and imagine for a moment or two that you are resourced, safe, valued, connected, that there's enough and you can act from this place of being resourced. What does your body feel like? What position, what shapes might you make with your body to really feel that? If you don't want to, or you prefer not to move, draw something, draw a shape or a pattern. Perhaps if words come to mind, you can write them down. Have a think about what helps and supports you to be and to access this state of being. Is it practices, places, people, certain people, objects? Just really feel into that state for a moment. Now let's switch things a bit. Let's make things a bit more urgent. Your phone pings. There's an email reminding you there's a deadline. You're afraid you're not going to make it, but if you don't, you're going to miss out on some funding. The kids need attention. You've just seen a news article with some horrendous climate data. What does your body start to feel like now? What shapes might your body make to convey that feeling? Or what patterns might you draw? Are there any words that come to mind? Just stay with that feeling for a minute or so. Now let's have a think. How normal is this state for you? How often do you find yourself in this way? And let's think, what kind of decisions do we make when we're in this state every day, when our nervous system is a bit up? What kind of decisions do we make? What kind of decisions are we capable of making? Just write for a moment or two about what you're noticing. How might we access more of the first state? Now feel free to carry on with your own process of noting things down that you've noticed for a moment. Or if you'd like to, feel free to share a few words in the chat, just headlines, and then we can see where people are at. Right, just half a minute more. Great. Thank you to those who are writing in the chat. That's really interesting. And a good question there, which we'll come back to later. Thank you.
I love some of the reflections. Really good. Ivan, notes you're super not normal for me to feel exhausted with an abundance of time. It feels good even if performed. I called Anthea in a bit of a panic today. I said, Anthea, we're doing an exercise on urgency, but we're doing it from a first world perspective. What about the urgency of the global majority, feeling it, the global south? And I've done a lot of development work in Africa, and I see urgency every single day. And what we have here in this exercise is almost a luxurious form of urgency, So what are we going to do about it? And she said, relax, Nick, relax, pause. Everything's going to be fine. And it's true. There are different levels, aren't there? Pretty much. So we're starting to see, yep, it's urgent. But there's something about us responding urgently as a way of being in ourselves that causes problems, I think. A lot of problems. So as movements and as an activist with several movements, the way I witness this between activists and also between movements tends to be what we call bridging and breaking and bridging. Yeah, urgency can serve a useful purpose in bringing people together for a collective, collective action. So if we're fighting perhaps the government's policies on the environment, or government policies, draconian policies on protest rights and so on and so forth, it kind of brings a lot of us together. But also, it can cause breaking. Yeah, urgency can form this bridge, but it can also cause breaking, where we don't often see, because of this almost hierarchy of urgency, we don't see what other people are going through. And that is kind of the conversation that I called Anthea about in a panic, saying, what about the global south within all this urgency, this first world urgency, the exercise that we're doing here? We should recognize that, yes, this is our situation right now, and this is what we can do in service, not just of ourselves, but of course, wider humanity. So perhaps something I would like us to reflect on as well is how urgency in your particular line of thinking, work, activism, etc., affects breaking and bridging. Yeah, how can we form a bigger we within your particular viewpoints? How can we build bridges within, there are closed bridges and there are further bridges that we need to build. Further bridges are those that we are almost totally opposed to, and we need to try and build those bridges if we're going to form a collective we. And there are, closer bridges, within environmental movements. A lot of movements that I'm working with, some wouldn't work with each other. And I look at them and I say, we're as close as can be. Why can't we find our common, purpose and pull this thing along together? But no, it happens. And within individuals as well, we find that. And of course, infused within any notion of urgency is this matter of time. Justice also calls us to speak about time in that respect. And with time, we're caught up in this linear, almost Western notion of time that we have to wrestle with in our activism and in our relationships, and how we see the problems that we face being resolved. And urgency can breed polarity within groups and also between groups. How do we deal with those? And within that, Anthea, did you want to say something?
Oh, sorry, I was on mute, and I was jumping in, and I was on mute. Is now a good time to jump in?
Yes, go for it. Just got it.
I'm just wondering if it would be helpful for us to offer, sorry, a tangible example of what breaking rather than bridging in that moment of crisis might look like. I mean, I can think of one.
Yeah.
I'm sure you can think of one. Perhaps if we each offer one, and then
Yeah.
it might start to kind of flesh this out and make it a bit real.
Sure. I almost don't want to name sort of movements and so on and so forth, but we saw okay. No, yeah. What we often see is movements calling out each other, you know, for not perhaps satisfying the full demands of their cries, you know, of the needs of a particular situation or a particular moment. And we saw that very much at the beginning, for example, of XR, you know, in 2019, and sort of being called out by other movements for various things. And there we have an opportunity actually to dialogue. We've seen a lot of bridging recently within XR, you know, prior to the big one. And, you know, I use XR as an example because it's been 5 years going, and there are a lot of examples there of breaking and bridging. And this issue of justice always comes up, you know. Again, there are almost hierarchies of justice that people want to attend to, or movements want to attend to, and our justice is more urgent than your justice, and so on. What were you thinking of?
I was thinking of I saw it on social media, I think just yesterday, where Greta was talking. I think she was and she had, I think she had an Afghan woman with her. She had a couple of women with her. Was one of them Palestinian? Forgive me, I don't remember the detail of it, but she was talking about the politics of what's going on. And some guy like invaded the stage and got up and grabbed the mic off her and was just like, I'm not here to hear about politics. I'm here to hear about the environment and climate. Like, it's such a small example, but it encapsulates what happens.
Absolutely.
I've seen the same thing when you know, and I know you've seen it because we talked about this, when environmental or climate change campaigners say we haven't got time to talk about justice. We're not going to talk about identity politics. And in doing that, and even in phrasing it like that, in that way that is frankly a bit of a dog whistle to those who do those movements down anyway, in even phrasing it like that, that's a break. Whereas actually that's making a break rather than a bridge. Whereas the bridge would be, even if you don't have the capacity to work on all of those issues, as well as whichever local aspect of climate change it is that your small group is doing, there are still ways to frame the language, to frame what you're doing, to choose your words so that you're encompassing the broader whole, and so that you're, you know, like, it's
absolutely,
to me that's the difference between I mean, so we should be clear, like, breaking and bridging is a methodology that is you know, sort of taught and practiced by the Othering and Belonging Institute in California. They've got a European program,
Berkeley,
but they get communities together, don't they? Like, I've not worked with it. Next week with Vanessa we'll have someone who has worked with this methodology, and it seems applicable to a number of these questions on the script that are coming up, that where we're sort of driven by some need that is ultimately about a scarcity. It's a scarcity feeling. And it causes us that scarcity feeling. In fact, several people said scarcity. Well, I think, I don't know if somebody used that word scarcity, but they were the words that meant it in the comments on the chat from the exercise, which is why that was so helpful. And in that scarcity, that's where we're like, well, there's not enough, so we can't do that. Even if we are in the more privileged position here.
I think, and just going back a couple of steps to the Greta example, when I saw that clip, I just thought, oh, you see, this is what urgency that drives us into militant particularisms, you know, where we can only focus, you know, blanket view. The environment is inherently political. The crisis we face in terms of the climate and ecological emergency, it's inherently political. You cannot escape from that. Now, if you tell me you don't want to talk about politics, the politics of what is happening, the catastrophes that are happening in the Middle East at the moment, because we've come here only to listen or to be inspired about the climate, then it tells me you don't understand the full picture. And that is what urgency unfortunately does to us. We get into this what's neuroscientists, psychologists call the amygdala freeze. It's fight or flight, and we get into that mode and we don't see it.
But that's what's really interesting to talk about here. And I think that's where it comes back to your point, where you said you phoned me earlier and you were like, oh, but we're doing this this is like privileged urgency. What about what's going on in the global south? What about if you're up to here in floodwater? The thing is, there's something about for me, like the most important point about this, about the urgency, that we have some control over ourselves, right? We can each take responsibility for ourselves here. So if we're going to do that, for me, a really important thing is realizing the extent to which we are run by our nervous systems, and that when we get in these states, we are not in the best positions to make really good analytic or generous decisions. Somebody asked earlier, but surely, is it always bad to make decisions from that state? I mean, yes, you're right. A little bit of adrenaline does sharpen things, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
Deadline sharpens me up and I get my writing done. But to operate in a fight or flight state, actually, our perception is narrowed at that point. We've already gone past the point where we can take in a wide variety of stimuli. We've already gone past the point in our nervous system activation where we can engage in conversation. We've got to the point where we're more likely to see things in very black or white terms. We're less likely to be able to deal with nuance and paradox. We're less likely to be able to deal with both and. We're more likely to do the either or. And that's where we can end up in movements doing the same things. Even, so one version is it, oh yes, we might say, we might find environmentalists who don't yet get the concept of climate justice going, oh no, well, we haven't got time for that. But then we can even do it ourselves when we're calling them out. We can even make the break then. Right?
Absolutely. And we do.
All the way down at that point if we are also in that state of not enoughness.
Yeah.
Which has led to it.
I some time ago and I've seen that with 3 different environmental groups that I'm part of. I've seen along the journey sort of people saying, no, we can't deal with this particular justice issue. And then I've seen an exodus of people, from the movement just because of that. And I think, no, this is actually an opportunity to have a deeper discussion, and just to acknowledge that, a lot of people deal with urgency. We all deal with urgency pretty much every day in certain respects. Yes, I highlight the global south, and in multicultural societies such as this, of course, people who are otherized in many ways, have to deal with urgency all the time in order just to be, just to and even thinking about becoming. This is we're talking about just to be. I want to offer you this. And we talked about this, offer you this poem by Paul Laurence Dunbar called "The Mask," which and I said to you, look, I wear a mask on pretty much every day in order to deal with my urgency. And the poem goes something like this. And forgive me if I miss out 1 or 2 words. I'm just from memory. We wear the mask that grins and lies. It hides our cheeks and shades our eyes. This debt we pay to human guile, with torn and bleeding hearts we smile, and mouth with myriad subtleties. Why should the world be overwise in counting all our tears and sighs? Nay, let them only see us while we wear the mask. We smile, but oh great Christ, our cries to thee from tortured souls arise. We sing, but oh, the clay is vile beneath our feet and long the mile. But let the world dream otherwise. We wear the mask. And the mask really is a coping mechanism within the prevalence of urgency of our being and becoming.
I had no idea you can recite poetry amongst your other skills.
It is one of my favorites, I have to say.
That's fantastic. I didn't know that.
You know, yeah, and that is how we cope.
That's right. And I think this, I'm just looking at a comment Lillian has put in the chat saying, I'd offer that fear and trauma create the sense of scarcity. And I think you speaking of the mask is a really important reminder for those of us who don't have to wear a mask all the time, of what that's doing and creating a situation of urgency. And it also raises this, I think, this point about not drawing equivalences. Like recognizing the particularity of people's situation, which is that everyone living under modernity and extractive capitalism is going to have a level of probably anxiety and fear and trauma in their system, right? But that is to draw no equivalence. There is no equivalence between the traumas that some people have experienced because of structural hierarchies that have been imposed of race and class, and you know, 7,000-year-old one of gender and patriarchy.
Like, the longest pandemic, as I call it.
Right. So all that is there because I think you know it's very easy to get quite sort of, you know, it's very easy to get in sort of a bit of a muddle about this of either like, well, you know, how dare you say that, you know, you suffer trauma, you're privileged, you know, like what are you talking about? You know, I suffer much more of this, you know, so that can go on. Or you can have a person saying, oh right, well, I'm really privileged, so of course I have all these privileges. I have many of them myself, actually. I'm middle class, and you know, there's loads of it. And yet there are particular things that this system does, and of course you can hide behind us. It's funny, I think of the shield, actually, like the shield of privilege. And when we've got the shield up, we don't need to acknowledge our vulnerability, and we don't need to acknowledge sort of these things that are going on, which is how it is that urgency and some other habits become very prevalent in the dominant culture. I think it's arguable. I think Ivan, do put this in the chat, please. The work of Sophie Banks, who I do some work with in Healthy Human Culture, is really powerful on this, at looking at the kind of societal patterns we get in, and the way that the dominant culture effectively has just adopted what are ultimately trauma patterns of being stuck in either fight or flight or numbness, you know, with their different effects, and thinks they're normal. You know, we see them in the workplace, we see them kind of lauded as, you know, if you're successful, if you're academically successful, if, you know, if you're doing well, then you're doing these things.
I see a beautiful reflection from Mariana in the comments there, you know, really, really deep. Thank you, Mariana. Absolutely, you're right. If I just read it out very quickly, thank you very much for this conversation. I appreciate the discussion, but in my view, we are all here because we have problematized the scripts of urgency. Absolutely. Further analyzing the problem is very interesting, but perhaps we could dedicate the rest of the discussion on how to deal with it. Yes, Mariana, we recognize that as well. And in fact, that is part of the reason why Anthea decided that I should sort of be involved in this this particular conversation about urgency, which is based on my work with the transition movement, and specifically Transition Town Brixton. The movement is a movement that is defiantly positive. You would not see Transition Town as sort of out on the streets raging against the machinations of the system, as it were. But what we do is work in communities to try and find solutions, and work with this Buckminster Fuller sort of aphorism, you know, there's no use fighting the existing system, but build a new system that makes the old one look obsolete. So we very much focus on that within the transition movement. So I bring that here as well. But we start off with problematizing the the issue of urgency, because as I often say, we cannot heal what we don't understand. So this is just an invitation to try and better understand the urgency of not just the situation exogenous to us, but also the situation within us, how urgency makes us feel, and how it's perhaps clouds our views or constrains our views in terms of finding solutions. Any reflections on what Mariana has put?
I was thinking, actually, one of the best things that we can do in response to this for now is move to the next exercise and looking at the time. I think we probably need to do that to leave enough time for discussion afterwards.
Yeah.
So, that's not a kind of like moving away from it, because I want to come back to it, because there's a lot there. Thank you. Oh, somebody's just put Resma Menachem's My Grandmother's Hands In. Thank you. Yes, absolutely, totally agreed. Really important on this.
I would just want to say that I think, yeah, we should transition into a tool, since it was asked and it was planned. And for me, what I'm again constantly diving back into childhood, we grow up being taught that slow and steady finishes the race, and tortoise is the archetype to follow, the wise moral of the tale, and yet we grow up wanting to be rabbits nonetheless. And that is, I mean, on this like very personal level also that Mariana is spotlighting, is this, that like you can't get out of rabbit mode if you're living in a colony of rabbits, and going against that grain is so difficult on a personal level to go counter to this. But I'm gonna pause recording. Thank you both so far, and everybody who's been with us, so that we can go into a surveillance-free zone of interaction. So.